Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I appreciate the turnout this morning. Mostly, I want to start by thanking the American voters who gave us a much more interesting election to talk about than we would have guessed when we scheduled this months ago. So there's no shortage of material, which I appreciate. I want to thank our panelists. Obviously, this is a fabulous group of people, all friends of the Wall Street Journal of long standing. Peter Hart, founder of Hart Research Associates. David Axelrod, who's a longtime Obama advisor, obviously, and director of the Institute for Politics at the University of Chicago. Bill McIntyre, founding partner of Public Opinion Strategies. Scott Reed, who ran Bob Dole's presidential campaign, and most recently, senior political strategist for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and the guy who probably had the best night of anybody in the country last Tuesday night. So thank you all for being here. We're going to talk amongst ourselves for a while, then we're going to open it up for questions. There'll be some roving microphones for you all, and feel free to think as we go along about how you want to throw these guys off with questions as we near the second half of the hour. Let me start by asking each of you to respond very quickly in a couple of sentences to a simple question, which is, and Peter, I'll start with you and we'll just go that way. What is the lesson each party should take, not will take, but should take from what happened last Tuesday?
Okay, first of all, I've got to thank Jerry. I mean, the chance to relive last Tuesday night is special and marvelous. And Jerry, you're awful nice to allow us to do it. I know Scott's going to find it difficult, but for David and myself, it's a special chance. I'll take a lesson, which it will be a reverse, and it'll be on the Republicans. And the reverse that I would say is there's a difference between a wave election and a mandate election. And the Republicans got a wave election, but I don't think they got a mandate election. And that is that the voters, I think, are telling us something about not only the president, but they're telling us a lot about the system. And I think if the Republicans look at this as simply a message election like 1974, or another one of the wave elections, 1994, then I think they will be off track. So I'll start there.
David?
Well, first of all, Jerry, if you're really grateful to the voters, there were so few of them you could probably write them individual notes.
We invited them all here today.
Commend them for their participation. And that's one of the lessons, which is if you spend billions of dollars telling people that everybody and everything sucks, they won't vote. Yeah. And we had the lowest voter turnout since 1942. There are a few others, though. One is the candidates actually matter. And you talk about Scott Reed. The reason he needs to be commended and the reason he had such a good year is because he spent a lot of time supporting candidates in primaries who he thought would be good general election candidates, and that mattered. If I had looked back at this election a year ago and knew nothing but that it was the 6th year of the president's term and that 7 seats were in red states, and 6 of them the president lost by an average of 19 points, I would have said, yes, the Democrats are going to lose the Senate. Republicans picked up a couple of extra seats in Colorado and Iowa because they had good candidates. Another lesson is that it's good to have a good field goal team, but you have to get far enough down the field to win the game. So it's great to have, analytics and micro-targeting, but that's worth a point or two in an election. And it's not a substitute for a message. Tactics are not a substitute for a compelling message. That's a lesson that the Democratic Party should learn. I agree with Peter's evaluation what Republicans should learn or take away from this election. It would be a mistake to think of it as a mandate election. It would be a mistake for Democrats to be comforted by the notion that demographics and the map favor us in 2016 and that somehow we can win a tactical victory in 2015. We didn't have a very strong message as a party in 2014, and we paid a price for it. We have to have a stronger message around economics in 2016.
Bill?
Well, I think on the Democrat side, Democrats lost the House vote amongst white voters by 20-plus points for the third cycle in a row, and they lost the white man in this race by 31 points. I thought Huffington Post did this work. I didn't think of it. It was a terrific poll. They asked people, here's a list of issues, what's most important to you? People picked economy and health care. And they said, hey, what are Republican candidates talking about? And they said, hey, economy and health care. What are Democratic candidates talking about? And they picked women and social issue as the #1 issue. And I think that war on women campaign left an economic message unspoken by the Democrats. And the margins by which they're now losing non-college white voters, including losing non-college white women by 12 points, whites are still 70-75% of the electorate. And you cannot keep losing elections and as a Democrat walking away from an economic message. On the Republican side, I think the Republican side is that you got to realize, and our firm wrote an op-ed on Sunday in the Washington Post saying, look, it doesn't change demography. You have to compete with Latinos, and you have to be competitive or else, and you have to fix the party brand. And the Republican Party's remaining problems did not get fixed because you had a great election. And this is a very volatile country, and 2 years from now, we could be sitting here with a very different result unless those remaining lessons for Republicans are kept in mind.
Scott?
Our biggest takeaway from 2012 was that candidates matter, and that when you hear their candidates out there running and the Republican side that want to come to Washington and shut the place down, that's like a threshold issue for us. That's why we stepped in. That's why we got involved in 14 of 15 primaries. Because our secondary message to these candidates when we met with them earlier on was that governing matters. And governing is important. If you're going to come here, that has to be part of what you're going to do. So we went with a candidate matter governing. The other thing that really caught our attention after Election Day was early voting. For the first time, Republicans tied with Democrats on early voting. Usually we'd lose by 10 or 15 points. And the reason we did well on that is because we tried. To Bill's point with the Latinos, you've got to try. And we made it a part of all the campaign plans and everybody we visited with, and we think it made a difference at the end of the day.
I failed to introduce, and I apologize, Janet Hook, my colleague, who needs no introduction. That's why I didn't do it. But
Nice.
Flattery.
Everybody-
Your
everybody-
boss. Yeah, my boss, yeah. Anyway, well, thanks so much for being here, guys. This is really, it's great to have you all in one place, so I don't have to bother you one by one. You all, in some ways, in answering Jerry's question, suggested that maybe both parties have something to learn and to change. Republicans thinking about the demographics and Democrats maybe thinking about their message. And it was kind of a forehead-slapping election. And yet, I have to say, 1 week later, things in Washington look kind of the same. People throwing down gauntlets, and Obama being, if anything, more confrontational, Republicans being also pretty confrontational. I'm just wondering whether you see any prospect that now with divided government, under these circumstances, anything happens. Is gridlock destined for the next 2 years, or do you think that there's any prospect for change before the 2016 election?
I'm from Chicago. I'll let these Washington guys answer.
I'm very upbeat about the fact that Speaker Boehner and Leader McConnell actually like each other. This is the first time in my lifetime that there's been a speaker and a leader that actually liked each other. And I think that's a good sign. I think they both know what this election was about. I think their teams work well together. And I think there's going to be a chance to get some things done. They both respect each other. They respect each other's institution. And I think that's a big sea change.
My first boss in politics was a guy named Joe Gaylord, who ran the Congressional Committee, and then he was Newt's guy for a long time. And when the very first day I was hired, Joe gave us a speech where he said, elections have consequences, candidates matter, somebody's going to win. And I think so often about that because we woke up with a headline today saying the Senate's going to vote on the XL pipeline. And guess what? Elections have consequences. This is a issue that has been bottled up in the Senate for years. I believe that when Republicans say, "Hey, we passed 40 different economic bills that never got a single vote in the U.S. Senate," I think there will be more votes. I think more will get done, and I think over time. A president, and we've solved this with George Bush, and we've seen it with other presidents when the Congress on their side. It still pushes the agenda forward in a way that makes stuff get done. And I do think, and this is where Peter and I, we did our poll, we asked people, what's the message you want to send with your vote? And the message was, for God's sake, stop fighting, get things done. And so when I talk about the Republican Party fixing its brand, this is a terrific time for the Republican Party legislatively to pass a bunch of legislation, say, here's the direction we're headed, and then leave the chips fall where they are in terms of what actually gets what's passed or signed.
I have no doubt that if these two guys were making the decisions over there, that a lot of things would get done. The reality is the Republican Party, this is what worries me, the Republican Party just ran a race that primarily was based on their opposition to the president. $1 billion spent on telling people we're going to stop the president. And you've got a whole lot of people who were elected there who don't think compromise was the message, who believe that conflict and opposition, perpetual opposition, was the message. I don't necessarily think McConnell and Boehner believe that, and it's good that they get along, Scott, because they can commiserate about their caucuses down the line.
And I would pick up exactly where Bill and David were, and that is, you look at everything, and the voters sent a very clear message, and the very clear message didn't have to do with policy. Obviously, they want the economy to move forward, but much more than that. What they said is, we want you guys to get something done. We've hated the culture. We hate everything that's going on. And yet, off we went and spent billions of dollars on this election, and guess what? It wasn't spent out of the goodness of the hearts of the Koch brothers and Steyer and everybody else. They have an agenda. And as David said, the biggest problem, Scott, is that you've got caucuses. And if it were only about the leadership and the discipline there, it would be fine. But we're in a 2016 cycle already, and guess what? You're going to have everybody with their own agenda. So the Republicans, yes, need to deal with their brand, but the difficulty is that they go back to another question which we asked Bill, and that is, would you carry a protest sign for a day if you could? 57% of the people said that they would. And then we asked them what the protest sign would cover. Everybody on the Democratic side had all of these nice, common liberal issues, and everybody on the Republican had all of the conservative issues. And in the end of the day, they talk to their constituents that they're representing, and coming up with that consensus is going to be the challenge.
Okay, well, let me raise right away one of the issues where that difficulty in finding consensus has already become clear, which is immigration. And I do want you to talk about this one, David. How should the president approach it? And Scott, you supported some candidates, helped elect some candidates who don't exactly agree with the chamber on this issue. How do you deal with that? How are they going to deal with it?
No, I think this is going to be a very interesting case in point, because you heard Bill talk about the fact that the Republican Party needs to expand its appeal to Hispanic voters. And the first thing we may see is the Republican Party recoiling from an executive order if the president takes it.
But should he do that?
Well,
that's my first question.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, this is not going to be a popular answer in this room, maybe, but I think he should do it, because I don't think there's going to be action on immigration reform. I don't think that, given the makeup of the Republican caucuses, and given the internal strife within the Republican Party, and given the fact that we're beginning a presidential cycle, I don't see immigration reform coming through the Congress. We had a bill, and the chamber was helpful in this. We had a bipartisan bill. 68 senators voted for it in this last Congress. Never got a vote on the floor of the House. Speaker Boehner could put it on the floor tomorrow, and there'd be it would be approved, and the issue would go away. If people need to understand, the president honestly does want to solve problems. I know in this town, like this morning's paper, he signed a deal with China on climate change, and the speculation was all about whether this was to help 2016 candidates. No, it was to try and deal with climate change. He really wants to solve problems. The immigration reform is a problem that's been lingering for a very long time. I was in a room with him in 2009 with Republicans and Democrats who had supported immigration reform before to talk about how to pass it. It's been 5 years. And at some point you have to say, we have to move forward. And I think he will move forward.
The Chamber's been advocating meaningful immigration reform for over 10 years. And as we went into pushing these candidates and meeting with these candidates, we're not a 100% organization. Nobody agrees with us 100% of the time. By the way, that may be a good time to mention that we endorsed 6 Democrats for the House this time. 5 of them won. We spent money on their behalf. So we're not a one-issue operation. We believe with the new makeup of the House and the Senate, there's an opportunity for meaningful immigration reform. It needs to be done in a sequenced way. It'll start with probably the most vote getter, which is border security, then move to H-1 visas, then close with people that are already here in the country. That will probably get the least amount of votes, but we think that would be healthy for the country and healthy for the business community. The business community is looking for stability. That's what makes the economy grow. We all know we need to grow this economy and get to real growth, and we think that's an important step in that direction.
Do you have immigration thoughts, Peter? Bill?
Well, I hear both sides of this, and I know one thing. If that's going to be the opening gambit in this, it's going to be a divisive year.
It won't be the opening gambit.
He's talking about the president.
Yeah.
Oh, the president's, I'm sorry, yes.
Then I feel differently. We're not partisan up here.
So are you telling the president don't do that as your opening bid?
Well, I'll go back to the beginning of his presidency. I would, of course, say that if you could rerun the whole presidency, I happen to believe in the stimulus bill, but I would have gone for a bipartisan stimulus bill. And I think you would have had a different atmosphere from the beginning. I think if we start with immigration, and your point is exactly right, David, but what it does to the optics and what it sets up for the next 2 years, I think is going to be very challenging.
Well, yeah, I understand that. That's the argument. But if the argument is on every one of these issues that if you do this, we will misbehave, that's going to be a constant refrain for the next 2 years. So I understand the ups and downs of this. By the way, I would have been for a bipartisan stimulus bill too if we could have gotten one.
Been better off.
Okay, enough about 2014. Let's talk about 2016.
That didn't take long.
No, actually, what I'm interested in is your reading of the midterm results, the message from the voters, and how it affects your thinking about what kind of candidate the parties need. I mean, for the Democrats, the question is more, given the state that the elections have left your party in kind of a mess, and given the message that you hear from the voters, whether it feels like Hillary Clinton is the best person to lead your party at this point. And for the Republicans, also given the ups and downs of what the results showed, how that affects your thinking about what kind of a candidate works best.
Well, I'm from Chicago, so I think I'll let these Washington.
Oh, nice try.
You know, I think that, as I said at the opening, that one thing this election reproves, we learned that message matters, strategy is more important than tactics. Tactics have to follow strategy. I think the danger for Secretary Clinton is that, as was the case in 2007, her candidacy is out in front of the rationale for it. And she should not rely too much on, we do have an electoral vote advantage. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows that 242 number. We can argue whether it's 242 or 232, but Democrats start off with an advantage. And when we have demographic advantages, it's a different electorate in 2016. But that should not give her solace that the job is done. I think the candidate who's going to win in 2016 is a candidate who aggressively and in a forward-thinking way deals with this fundamental issue of the stagnancy of wages, the problems of the middle class, the lack of economic mobility that are central to who we are as a country. And if I were advising her, I would say that is the platform I would run on. I would offer constructive ideas about how to do something about that. That is what courses through our politics and has been for 20 years. That's why voters are perpetually discontent. And she needs to jump on that message and lead on that message.
I agree with everything that David just said. I would.
Is this being taped? I want that piece of tape.
Yeah, I always agree with you, David. But I think there are two things here. I think the most important thing that comes out of elections, 6-year elections, is over the course of history, they tend to prove which way a country is going. I think 58, we had no idea that Jack Kennedy was going to become the next president. I don't think in 66, people said Richard Nixon's going to become our next president. I don't think in 74, people said our next president is going to be Jimmy Carter. Or in 2006, they said our next president is going to be Barack Obama. But the country was saying something in those 6-year elections. We are unhappy with the direction. We're unhappy with the way things are going. There was an opening for the opposite party. I think that there is an opening here. My challenge to Secretary Clinton would be she needs to have one campaign. I felt that 2008, there was a different campaign every hour, every day. And I did not feel that her 2014 messages coming out of New York and New Hampshire had that same kind of resonance where it's one message. She needs to know.
Let me just say, though, having been on the other side of that race,
Yep.
from New Hampshire on, I thought she was a very effective candidate. And believe me, I wasn't happy about that. But she was much more visceral. She was closer to the ground. She was talking about people and their lives and talking about her life in terms that they could understand and relate to. And if she is that candidate in 2016, she will be a strong candidate. But she has to throw caution to the wind and essentially get out of the cocoon of inevitability and really compete for it.
I still agree with everything you say.
All right, I'll keep trying.
Scott and I have had about a 30-year career. We've lived in a very hierarchical party, which nominates the next person in line. So as Republicans, you feel a deep unease because we don't have that person. I'm a pollster. I look at the map and demographics, and I think about if you look at who the Democrats elected as president, you have John Kennedy, but you look at Harry Truman, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and arguably Al Gore in terms of the popular vote. They were Southerners, and they messed up the map. And so it's hard not to look at this map and say, look, our firm represents a lot of candidates in the U.S. Senate who might run for president, and they are, and
That would be about half the Senate as far as I can tell, right?
well, that's our firm's client list. But
Bill got his business done.
but I would like to, if I had a druther for a candidate, I would like to run somebody from a blue or purple state who's a governor because again, we've talked a lot about Washington. But since the president's been elected, Republicans have elected literally roughly 1,000 new state legislators. The state legislative chambers are at an all-time historic high for Republicans. We have a almost record number of governors. And those governors and those legislatures are out there crafting, right of center policy about stuff people care about. And I would feel a lot more comfortable, because I agree with David about what the 2016 election about. I just think someone outside of Washington who's a governor who has a different track record in terms of the kind of issues and stuff they do would be a more articulate spokesperson for that campaign, because they would also get to run against Washington. And the other thing that's true about the Republican Party, it's not like our primary voters love Washington, D.C. They don't. That's one of the reasons that they kept electing Republicans, to kind of balance the president block, because they don't like what's happening. But I think it's really hard. I think it'd be a lot easier to run that anti-Washington campaign if you were a governor of the Republican Party.
Scott, you ran a presidential campaign for a Senate Majority Leader, so you know this story, right?
Well, and this is a good time to point out that the chamber does not get involved in presidential politics, so remember. But
Scott got his business done.
This election wasn't a mandate. I think it was an opportunity for the Republicans to lead for a little while. They've got about a 4 to 6 month window to get things done before Iowa and New Hampshire get started. I think if you could design a candidate on our side, he or she would be a governor from a Midwest state that's just been reelected, that's a social conservative, that has a little Tea Party, and is forward-looking and has an agenda. And that looks to Walker, that looks to Pence, that maybe looks to Kasich, maybe looks to Snyder. I think a lot of the Republicans are going to be waiting on what does Jeb Bush and Chris Christie do. And then I would just remind everybody that, as David knows, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, you've got to score in the beginning somewhere. You have to have a breakout state. And you can't underestimate Rand Paul's ability to go out and do non-traditional things as he's been doing for the last couple of years. He was a real secret weapon for us in this last election. We used him in 4 Senate states where there were libertarians on the move. And he was able to go in there and nullify that, especially in North Carolina, where that pizza delivery guy, the libertarian, was getting 11% of the vote, ended up with a lot less than that. So don't underestimate Rand Paul's ability to shake this thing up and score early, and if not win, finish in second place in some of those early deals, and that's going to rattle the whole thing.
You mentioned, Scott, a phrase that hadn't come up previously in this conversation, the Tea Party. I'm just curious what everybody thinks. Has the Tea Party been marginalized? What is it now?
Well, if you watch carefully what we tried to do with the Tea Party, we never said anything bad about the Tea Party specifically. If you think of what the Tea Party is about, they're about reducing the size and scope of government, less regulations, the Constitution, infrastructure spending. I mean, that sounds a lot like what the local Chamber of Commerce on Main Street's about. We were very specific, though. When a handful of bad actors went out and kind of hijacked the Tea Party and ran candidates that were clearly against free enterprise, that's where we stepped in. And we tried to, after we beat them, we tried to hug them and embrace them quickly because, we're from the school of politics. It's about addition, not subtraction, and we need that part of the coalition. So I think the Tea Party's problems were they ran really poor candidates. They recruited people that were not capable of being even in the freshman league of this business, and that's why we were able to beat them, and that's why they quieted down. Where they go, nobody knows.
Well, from a polling perspective, Peter and I in the NBC Wall Street Journal polls, Wall Street Journal NBC.
Thank you.
But we did a then and now, because 4 years ago, the Tea Party, about 28% of the country said they were Tea Party members. Today, it's 18%. The fave of the descriptor Tea Party has shifted. And the percent of Republicans who say that they're Tea Party members dropped from roughly the high 50s, low 60s to the mid 40s. But I believe that having our firm, we work all the time in active Republican primaries. A majority of the voters in a Republican primary think of themselves as being Tea Party members. And in my mind, those are still the core Republican primary voters. And no one's going to win the nomination for this party unless they find a way and they are in sync with these issues. And in my mind, a lot of what the Tea Party's become is, if you said in the old days, hey, who's a Republican primary voter and what do they believe? That's sort of kind of what the people say their Tea Party Republicans believe.
If I can pick up just on this, and that is, in every set of tabulations that we do for NBC and the Wall Street Journal, we look at Republicans who identify with the Tea Party and those who are not part of the Tea Party coalition. And there's a huge 20, 30 point split on so many issues. And you look at the non-Tea Party Republicans, they look much more like independents, they look much more moderate, et cetera. And I think the challenge for the Republicans in the primaries is that the true party is going to turn out their people, and they're going to push the agenda. So it's nice to talk about how they got through the 2014 election, but they are going to be at the heart of anything that happens in 2016 in the early primaries.
What was striking to me about the very smart strategy that was run by Republicans in these primaries, Scott's candidates, were, I call it a victory by surrender strategy. We're just like those guys, except better. We believe in all those same principles as they do. The problem for the Republican Party for the last several cycles has been that this group has basically hijacked the nominating process. And so you had center-right Republicans. Mitt Romney was a center-right Republican when he was in office. John McCain was the definition of a center-right Republican, and they had to make Faustian bargains with the most strident voices in their party in order to get the nomination, thus obviating the advantage they took into the general election. To me, the challenge for a Republican candidate is, where are you willing to stand up to the base? Because if you don't stand up to the base somewhere along the line on some of these issues, immigration may be one of them, I don't think you can win a general election. And that's a problem, as Peter suggested, they still haven't solved.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
Janet. I just remember, that everyone talks about Bill Clinton in 1992 and the sister Soledad.
Soldier, yeah.
Soldier. I said, it was May of 92, he was the nominee. I mean, so the stand up to the party, I just like to remind people the Bill Clinton timing was after he was the functional nominee is when he decided to do that. Sorry.
It's a good urban myth.
No, it's good, but you're absolutely right about that, and that's why I think, a lot of what's been missed is the work that Priebus has been doing to try and change your nominating process in order to reduce some of these obstacles. And I know he hasn't succeeded in moving the convention as far back as he wants to, but I assume that one of the reasons why he wanted an early convention was to give the candidate more time to pivot away from the base.
But let me ask Bill a question. You're close to Jeb Bush, and obviously he brings a lot of assets to it. How does he maneuver between this Tea Party group and the core stands, which obviously seem closer to the general election?
That's a great question, Peter, but it turns out the panel is being led by Janet.
No, our instructions to the panelists was
No, you said to cross-talk. You didn't say cross-examine.
cross-examine.
There's a very
This
big
is like
difference
watching
in
Alison
terms.
Grimes answer the question about who she voted for president.
No one is bigger in the tank than me for the Bushes, and I've been for 31 years. But Jeb Bush on immigration said it's an act of love to come to this country. He supports Common Core. And when you talk about a candidate, I know this about Jeb. If he decides to run, he's going to run saying the exact same thing he's believed every single day, and he will engage a fight in the primary around his belief around Common Core and his position in immigration. And the other thing my personal hero, Joe Gillard, said is, guess what? That's why God made primaries. That's why we have political campaigns. We debate issues. So as you talk about why he would run and not flinch, and he would run exactly in the position he's had, and he would not back down, and that would be the party debate. Again, among my fun experiences was in 1998 when Senator McCain was making the decision to run for president. This is what's important about this process is he said, hey, do you think I can beat Bush? I said, well, I don't know, but can you beat, Forbes and Elizabeth Dole? And he said, Lamar Alexander. He said, well, yeah, I hope so. And I said, look, here's the point. Give Steve Forbes credit. The flat tax, no one talked about the flat tax till he ran for president. He put the issue on the schedule. And I said, John, what do you believe in? You believe in getting money out of politics. No one in the Republican Party wants to do that. But it became the law because of his campaign. It wouldn't have happened without that campaign. And John McCain.
Those were the days.
Those were the days. But I'm saying John ran a set of stuff because I said, look, that's your job as a candidate. Here's 4 or 5 things you want to say that no one else in this party wants to talk about, and they're never going to do it unless you run and either get the nomination or put them on the agenda. And so in Jeb's case, I have every confidence that if he should run, that what you've been hearing about Common Core and his position of immigration, I can hear him in the announcement speech.
And let me say, if he won the nomination doing that, that would make him a very formidable general election candidate. It's an open question as to whether he can do that. But if he did, that's my point. I think to win a general election, you have to be able to stand up to the most strident voices in your party.
Okay, enough about men. Let's talk about women. If you could all talk to me a little bit about the courtship of female voters in 2014 and also kind of what that says going forward. Obviously, we had a campaign where Republicans were actually pushing back more than they have in the past in trying to close the gender gap. Bill, you and Peter, you showed us in polling months ago that there were signs that the Democrats' advantage among women was dwindling. And a lot of Democrats really made the war on women a core part of their message. And I'm wondering whether that didn't work, whether it backfired, or whether there were other factors.
I'll start because Bill's got the statistics, which are compelling and important. But I really felt that the challenge for the Democrats was the way in which they went after the women's vote. I think that they talked to them in a narrow in a narrow fashion. I thought that they talked to him far too much on social issues rather than economic issues. I thought that the Democrats' challenge in 2014 is that instead of hanging together, everybody tried to run separately, and they ended up hanging separately. And the difficulty was that, and I think that the Udall race in Colorado is the best example of it, because I think he had a marvelous record, and I think he became a smaller candidate as he ran. And I think he ran so directly and so patently towards the women's vote that I think it worked against him. And I think that the Democrats have a tremendous argument with women, and they have a tremendous advantage. But as Bill will tell you, with lower income, less educated women, the Democrats lost a lot of votes, and I think in part because we didn't get to the economic message.
No. You want to?
No.
He said you have great statistics.
He's thinking it right now.
No, why don't you jump in, David?
Look, I thoroughly agree with this. One of the things we do in politics is we sit on the back of the truck and we look at what happened the last time, and then we clumsily try and emulate what happened the last time. You know, in 2010, Michael Bennet won in Colorado by emphasizing these issues, and so the Udall campaign doubled down on that. And part of it is what Peter said. I think candidates mistakenly try to run away from the president. I don't think you can run away from the president of your own party. I think you look political and phony doing it, and they did. And so they were looking for tactical advantages in all these states, and this was one of them. And so in the absence of a big message, you know, you get tactics that look phony and political, and what was missing was the economic message. You know, women feel, perhaps even more than men, the strain of living from paycheck to paycheck, of supporting households and so on. And a strong economic message is what's going to make a difference. We ran a track of media in the 2012 campaign that was aimed at women. And you know what it was about? It was about education. It was about pocketbook issues. Very little of it was about these women's health issues, and we had a 12-point gender gap in our favor in that election.
Yeah, and again, we are so Washington focused. I want to take a moment again and talk about the Republican Governors Association. They raised a boatload of money. Governor Christie was enormously effective, and it changed the race. And again, as David said, you know, if you look back and say, okay, here's like a not shock. Republicans won Senate seats where they have enormous advantages. You know, this town, if you said, oh, we're going to pick up a couple of governor's races net, that's a stunning result. But I'm mentioning it now because, again, the governors, Republican governors and their candidates did a really much better job, as did the RGA, talking about education and talking about a lot of these gubernatorial accomplishments about the economy. And so what Janet's talking about is we had an internal chart in the Wall Street Journal tracking we were doing that said, look, here's the president's approval. Here's how women say they're going to vote for the Congress, and it's not a shocking midterm, which is the president's approval kept eroding, then the congressional ballot started shifting, and the point is that look, Republicans are getting totally hammered with African American and Latina women. Okay, but with white women, Republicans won this election again by 14 points. Mitt Romney won by 9 points. And as I said, to me, the stunner is if I said to you, hey, by the way, we look at white women who with less than a college education, and they're voting Republican double digits. If I were a Democrat and I looked at that number and said, oh my God, let's start leaving something on the table. How in the world are we losing less well-educated white women to Republicans? And the answer is, and I do think the answer is, at least the Republican credit, they try to talk about issues that people are most fundamentally concerned about, which is the economy.
If I were a Republican, though, I'd also look at these results and I'd say there was a huge drop-off among single white women, and you can't count and minority. You can't count on that in 2016. But one point I want to make about all these Republican governors who are making point of the success of the economies in their states. Congratulations to them for doing so well in this horrific Obama economy.
Well, yeah, because policy makes a difference. Again, I want to make this the Joe Gaylord show, my old boss, because my old boss in '82, when I started to run campaigns that were drifting away from Ronald Reagan, he kind of pulled me in the office and said, Bill, we're on the Queen Elizabeth, and we are stuck somewhere in the ocean between London and New York City. If you think you can take your candidates and swim to safety, they will drown. We have a big boat, and if you leave the big boat, you will drown. Please get your mind right. And it's hard to look at these results and from your party's perspective and say they never got the Joe Gaylord lecture because they left the big boat behind and they drowned.
Yeah. No argument here.
There's no doubt the war on women strategy was a huge disaster. It didn't work. You know, our polling was showing us that 6 out of 10 voters cared about jobs and the economy, and so we just stayed focused on that. And we didn't, you know, what's shocking about this cycle to me was there's very little talk of social issues. I don't remember seeing any campaign commercials run by any of the competitive Senate races that talked about social issues. It was always about the economy. Lastly, the biggest surprise to me was how these candidates ran away from the president. It really shocked me. You wonder why turnout was down and was deflated with their base. And they, you know, it started with Udall in August when he didn't show up for that president flying to Colorado to do his fundraiser. He stayed in Washington. And it was just amazing to us how all these candidates took the bait and couldn't even answer the question if they supported the president, let alone if they voted with him 96% of the time. That was part of the deflation problem, I think.
But 2 Republican governors who survived in Connecticut and Colorado didn't run away from the president. It's an interesting,
I agree.
Interesting counterexample.
Let me just ask quickly about one last piece of the coalition business, and then we'll open it up for your questions. And when we do that, I think there are 2 microphones that will be floating around. So, but just in the coalition building or deconstruction business, there was a question which we talked about a fair amount along the way with Bill and Peter and company about the Hispanic vote, and it's still unclear to me whether 2014, the actual election, showed some erosion of that part of the Democratic coalition or not. I'm just curious where each of you come down.
Well, I come down that it showed absolutely no erosion. There may be some in terms of turnout, but if I looked at the data in terms of how they felt about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, if anything, I thought that they looked stronger, and I thought they looked stronger in the exit poll. So the one group that I did not see massive changes in terms of overall attitudes was on Hispanics. If anything, I think, going back to the original question, I think the whole immigration debate has just sort of consolidated where the Democrats are.
Well, here's 2 numbers, 38 and 36. 38% is the Democrat vote among white voters, 36 is the percent among Hispanics or Republicans. So it's sort of stunning when you say, wow, Republicans have a Hispanic problem, that we're 2 points below what the Democrats got with the white voters. Having said that, let me be a good pollster. The 36% of Hispanics in the exit poll this time is when you get turnout this low, it's a different composition of turnout. Those are not the same Latino voters who are going to be coming to vote in 2016. And so I want to say, yeah, we got better, but my belief fundamentally, Peter, is, yeah, it's better. 36 is better than 26 or 27. But it doesn't mean that the composition of the Latino vote in 2016 is any fundamentally better. And Republicans had better watch out because, again, Mitt Romney won white voters by the highest margin since 88 and got smoked.
And obviously, and everybody in this room knows this, it's not simply a matter of the aggregate numbers, but where these voters live. And there are several states, Colorado, Nevada, Florida, where you can't seed Hispanic voters by 72-27, which is what happened last time, and expect to carry those states.
First poll we did in Colorado after Gardner got in the race against Udall, we had him getting 9% of the Hispanic Latino vote. It scared the hell out of us. So we tried to design a strategy to go forward there using Marco Rubio in ads, using Jeb Bush in ads, just speaking in Spanish. Yes, we bought a lot of Spanish media, but we also spent a lot of that on regular broadcast. We didn't run away from this. We did ads in Spanish in Arizona too, where it looks like Martha McSally is going to win by a whopping 156 votes. We did Spanish
waste
ads.
Your money.
I'd work, and the beauty to the the ads we did with Bush and Rubio, we spent a lot of our money on social media, and we were able to target it out, same ad, same 30-second ad, out to Hispanic and Latinos on YouTube and Pandora and all that other social media matter out there. So it was a deliberate approach. It's not the answer. We did it to learn a few things. We learned a few things. And again, we believe if you try, you can make a difference. And that's what we tried to do in a couple of these Senate races.
Questions? Start right there.
I'm curious if you all have done any polling to find out if voters might be attracted to a candidate who answers a question when a reporter asks them, or if they're in a debate, rather than doing the sidestep dance. And if you've done any polling to how all of the millions of people that have jumped through all the hoops to become U.S. citizens will feel and vote when the president opens the barn door.
I'm not a pollster.
Yeah,
He's from Chicago.
yeah, I'm from Chicago. I'll let the Washington
Got
guys.
the theme.
On the first question, no, not really. But there's always a perception. And when we do a lot of stuff about debates, you kind of ask people, do you feel the guy I'm Midwestern, guy means man or woman, did they answer the question? Did they seem candid? But those are perceptual standards based on two candidates, neither of whom are perfect. And so there's no perfect answer. There's just you compare these two people and those attributes. The data is fairly clear that the Latino community, and this is where Republicans are slipping, the Latino community has this first thing, which is, do you want us here, or do you want us in the country? And Republicans have a very difficult time so far holding the debate in a way that makes people feel welcome and included. But number two, the Latino community data is pretty clear, which is that they have some of the same concerns about border security, and they have some substantial concerns about not having a reward in terms of being first in line. Any reform would have to make these people put the last in line, so they're not bumping anybody who's been going through the process. And the Latino numbers on that topic are incredibly strong because it's their friends and families that have been waiting in line. And the trouble with our politics is that most of these bills do that. They do put you last in line, but the word amnesty has a power that whatever in these bills becomes amnesty. But anyway, the Latino polling data is incredibly clear that that there can be no reward to put people who are illegally ahead of those who've been waiting in line for citizenship.
The one point on this, the nativist language in the Republican primaries in 2012 were damaging, and not just with Hispanic voters, the president won 72% of them, but Asian voters voted 75% for the president, and I ascribe a lot of that to some of the rhetoric in the Republican primaries, and I think the Republicans are going to have to work hard to overcome that sort of impulse if they're going to put together any kind of a winning coalition.
Totally agree.
Other question?
There's a woman up here, Jerry.
Oh, I'm sorry, right here.
I have a question for the gentleman
Just
from
1 second.
Chicago.
Set yourself up for that one.
As long as it's not about the Bears.
Thank you. The president, the first lady, the vice president campaigned very heavily for Democratic Governor Pat Quinn, who lost. What does that election say about his standing, his clout back home? And 2 follow-ups, please. Do you expect the Obamas will live in Chicago after 2016? And how do you gauge the chances of Chicago getting the Obama Presidential Library?
Wow. You must be an ex-reporter. Are you a reporter? Yeah, 'cause Oh my goodness, hi. Sorry, yeah, because I recognize the 3-part question as that was a professional question right there. Look, Pat Quinn is a great friend of mine, has been for 40 years. I think he's got a big heart. I think he's a good man, but he inherited a very tough situation, and he never really got out from under the burden of all of that. And as I said, he carried an approval rating in that election in the mid in the mid-30s. What was remarkable to me was how long he defied gravity, not the fact that he lost. And no endorser, the president or anybody else, the first lady or anybody else, was going to change that dynamic, particularly against a candidate who was spending $68 million on the other side. And the unanimous verdict of the newspaper endorsements. People who say newspaper endorsements don't mean anything in this race, they actually did. When a guy has money to put on television again and again that he has every newspaper endorsement in the state, and they make a better case for him than he made for himself. So I wouldn't read too much into that. I'm hopeful about the library. I run an Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago, so I'm not a disinterested party here. But my feeling is that the president has deep roots in that community. That library can revitalize a part of Chicago that he represented and really needs it. And I'm hopeful that it goes there. As to where they live, I'm not going to dip my toe in that water.
I do have one quick thing, and it's a Wall Street Journal editorial before the election where Wall Street Journal saying, okay, everything we've been reading about is Kansas and the rebuke of the Republican governor. What could be happening is as you look at Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, perhaps Connecticut, that these incredibly high tax states are going to be voting Republican. And the rebuke's not going to be on the Republican governors who try to change or lower taxes. It's going to be a cautionary vote that says, wow, when you start raising taxes like that, there's a pushback.
Bill, let me just say one thing about this. There was an initiative on the ballot in Illinois in the same governor's race in which people were asked whether they would support a 3% surcharge on incomes over $1 million to support education, and it got 2/3 vote. So I wouldn't go too far down that line.
All right, well, that's good. That's our point. Friction, disagreement.
That's why we have parties, right?
When you lose Maryland by that margin.
But again, I go back to the candidate. There's no doubt that was a factor in the Maryland race. But I also go back to the candidates matter element there, because I don't think we had a particularly strong candidate in Maryland, and he went out of his way to prove
Opposed to the juggernaut of Larry Hogan. I mean, the guy hadn't been in office
look, I didn't say this was a battle of the Titans.
What I'm saying is that there's to me, a continued positive, as a Republican note, there's a balance. And when states drift way too far, and I think I'm listening who they are in terms of people's perception about taxes, that we end up with a correction, and the electorate corrects itself, and the correction is they voted for Republican governors for a different direction. And those are policy consequences that have meaning.
Yeah. We can go back and forth on this. I could talk Martha Coakley, but I won't.
Oh, do.
No, Massachusetts. I don't think that Massachusetts is a very progressive state. I don't think people voted against Martha Coakley because they disagree with the direction of the state, which has done very well. I think they voted against her because, nothing against her as a person. She's a demonstrably bad candidate, and she's proven it now in 2 elections.
Demonstrative. Right back there.
What impact?
Hold on, wait for the microphone, please. There you go.
What impact do you believe the administration's difficult relations with Israel will have on the 2016 election cycle, both at the presidential level and in Congress?
Any thoughts?
We don't do foreign policy either.
Okay.
I'm from Chicago.
Doyle?
No, let me just say, this was thought to be a big issue in 2012, and the president still won a very substantial majority among American Jewish voters. And it would be a mistake, first of all, because the basic support of the United States for Israel was very strong, but secondly, because Jewish voters, like women voters, have broad interests. And it's Jewish voters, and I'm Jewish, and I care deeply about Israel, but Jewish voters have broad interests. So to micro-target and say, we're going to make this the issue. Plus, Secretary Clinton has, if she's the candidate, very strong relationship and very strong support for Israel. So I don't think it's going to be a decisive issue in 2016.
It is, though, an opportunity for me to remind folks the number one issue in the Wall Street Journal NBC poll is, in the last 5 years that I paid attention to, is Ebola. The fact is, we ended the last 3 weeks of the campaign talking about Ebola and ISIS. And if we'd been sitting here 2 years ago and saying, what's the last 2 big major news stories? I know myself, I would have put those 2 on the list. And so it's a reminder that whatever we think is going to happen in 2016, stuff's going to happen around the world, and whatever that stuff is has more consequence and more
That's fair.
bearing on the decision than what we can project today.
And let us note on that we now have not one person in the United States of America being treated for Ebola 3 weeks after the frenzy.
Yep.
And we ought to take some lesson from that.
And there was only 1% of the voters in the end of the day who said it was a voting issue for them. Let's keep
go ahead.
going. There are a lot of other questions.
Doyle here and then over there.
Let me stay on the fundamentals for 2016. Obviously, the president's job approval had a major impact in this race. If the president's job approval stays roughly where it is, not dramatically higher or lower, and if there is something of an 8-year itch among American voters, and you can contest that if you want, do those factors countervail the Democrats' demographic advantage and basically start you out with a level playing field? Question one. I'll hold myself to two, though, David. And does Hillary Clinton have an Al Gore problem? Does she have to separate herself from the president she served without dissing the president she served?
Did he win? I can't remember.
That's
a disputed
in the popular
issue.
I'll start, Doyle, and then turn it with Dave. I think the one thing I'd like to bring back in terms of Hillary Clinton is we're talking about the first female president. Obviously, that is going to be a huge dynamic in it. But I think that one of the things that comes from 2008 and through her period as Secretary of State, she has actually passed the most difficult bar, and that is, I think she's credible as Commander-in-Chief. And that is a huge advantage, and the thing that we have not talked about in this hour very much is the whole area of safety and a sense of confidence. And I think that that's one thing that will be working very much in her favor. So the dynamic, obviously, and that's where I started, that it's going to be a challenge for Democrats if the president's job rating and the direction of the country remain low. I think the one thing that the Democrats have going for them is that there will be a sense of much greater confidence in terms of the economy. It will no longer be the Republican governors. I think there will be a sense that the economy has turned around. So that there are a lot of countervailing factors involved here, and I think in many respects, the basic dynamics work in Hillary Clinton's favor in terms of the safety issue, and I think the Democrats may get a break in terms of the economy.
Doyle, I think that history suggests that it's very difficult to elect, for the same party to elect a president after an 8-term presidency. George H.W. Bush defied that with some, great effort in 1988. So yeah, that's a factor. I don't know that it obviates all those other factors, but she. I think that in terms of running away from the president, I don't think it works any better for a presidential candidate than it works than it worked for the statewide candidates here. I think the real question is, can you project a vision for the future that builds on and is not simply a repetition of what people have seen? Can she lay out that aggressive agenda for the future that speaks to those squeezed middle-class voters? If she does that, I think she can argue that President Obama cut off the bleeding that we saw back in 2008, 2009, but we've got a lot of work to do to repair the middle class, and I have the plan to do it. To me, I think that would be a winning formula for her.
In the exit poll, about 85% of the people who disapproved the president voted Republican for Congress. And that number in the mid-80s is true through almost every midterm election. If you disapprove of the president, you vote for the opposite party. We know from Gallup that the political gravity is that's more likely the president will drop a few points than go up. It doesn't have to be the case. The economy could get better. I don't want to prejudge, but that's historic gravity. And then three, as David talks about fundamentals, if we were sitting here after 2016, if we're sitting here after a Republican wins the presidency, we would say the same fundamental thing, like, oh, look, the president's job approval was really low, wrong track was high, they were trying to get a third term for that administration, and guess what? You can't do it structurally. And so the president's job approval and the direction of the country will have enormous bearing. And if it's a drag, we'll all be sitting here after 2016 saying you can't overcome that kind of gravity.
Scott, I'm curious, you talked about the virtues of being a governor in the 2016 cycle, at least potentially. Can a governor do national security all right, or is he or she at a natural disadvantage if that's a prime issue by 2016?
Well, first of all, the reason I like the the governor model is because it's outside of Washington. I think that's really important, that people don't like Washington. They don't see it as answering any of the problems. But I think that a thoughtful approach to taking some foreign trips and meeting with some foreign leaders, just like every candidate has done, is an important part of getting ready to run for president. Lindsey Graham's talking about possibly running for president just in that space, as the national security space. So I think you're going to see a pretty healthy debate there.
Can I just make one more point on this succession thing? My view of presidential politics, and I've talked to some folks in this room about this, is that even when a president's popular, people tend to seek the remedy and not the replica. They want someone who has the qualities that they missed in that president. That's why I felt in 2007 that Obama could be a good candidate to succeed Bush. People wanted someone who was more nuanced, who understood the gray, who could handle the complexities in a way they felt that Bush did not. This tends to be a pendular thing. I think that in 2016, people are going to want someone who is a little less nuanced and a little less attuned to the complexity, someone who projects more of a sense of black and white certainty. And I don't mean that in a racial way, but in I actually think that is an environment that favors Hillary Clinton more than the 2008 environment, because she tends to be someone who speaks in simple declarative sentences and with great certainty.
We have a couple of minutes left. We have time for one last question. I'll take it from over there.
I'm actually not sure it's worthy of the last question, but I'm not going to step back. It's Margaret Talla from Bloomberg. Thanks. Nice to see everybody. I wanted to go actually back to the next Congress, but with an eye toward 2016. They opened yesterday talking a lot about how they want to do things differently. They don't want to obstruct. Harry Reid understood the being on the other side, how bad that is. But what I want to ask you is, do you think that there's a good chance that Democrats will just go ahead and flip sides and do what Mitch McConnell did to them for these last years? And does that have any bearing on setting up the 2016 races? If Democrats block Republicans from getting legislation, does that make Hillary Clinton's chances better, vice versa? What's the kind of correlation between whether anything happens in Congress and the next presidential campaign?
I think it's pretty slight. I don't think there's a lot of correlation. I think that Congress and the new leaders getting going is more about helping the Republican Party get its brand back together and to be for some things. And I think the presidential thing is on a different level, a different space, and there won't be anything.
I'll take a slightly different view from Scott. And my point would be, I think each cycle the voters have been saying, please change. We want something to be different. We're tired of big money. We're tired of the bickering back and forth. We're tired of our voice not being heard. We're tired of nothing getting done. And I think if the perception is that this is another cycle where nothing gets done and there's, quote, gridlock, I think the voters will once again try and look for somebody that is going to provide a sense of a coalition, a sense of being able to work across the party aisle. And I wouldn't be surprised if Hillary Clinton in 2016 talks more about her Senate record and her ability to work within the congressional dynamic than she does about her Secretary of State's record.
I would say obviously we had a bad midterm in 2010. That's an understatement. And by January of 2011 or January, February, the president's numbers were pretty healthy again. And the reason was we had a very successful midterm. And the volume of stuff that was done was breathtaking in that lame duck session. The volume of stuff that was done in that lame duck session was really breathtaking. It didn't please people on the left. It didn't please people on the right. But a lot of Americans were happy to see people working together to get things done. And I would hate to see us, I hope we're not in this sort of endless spiral of one party or the other simply lying on the tracks and trying to prevent any kind of agreement. One thing I want to say just to end is I'm, and I mean this very, very sincerely, I admire everybody on this platform, and I honor them for devoting their lives to this country and to trying to make this country a better place. We may have different views about how to deal with certain issues, but we need to restore that sense in that building of cooperation, the sense that we can disagree without disqualifying each other as Americans. And I think the American people want that as well.
Well, that seems like an appropriately optimistic note on which to end it. I do want to thank you guys. This is a stellar group of thinkers and, as I said at the outset, friends of Janet's and mine, and I appreciate your taking the time to do this, all of you. Thanks very much, and we'll do it again in 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.